Working? That's it. Swallow the microphone when you get there. Greetings to you all, and hi Rosemary, Rosemary and others, and Chris McKenzie, who's come over from the West Coast to listen to you, and he'll be coming next week because he's got strong views on the global settlement. And seeing he represented the Crown last time, he might give us some good insight information. So that'll be next week. It's a huge privilege to welcome these two guys, Campbell Roberts and Paul Gilberd. Campbell has been involved. Campbell can remember when the Salvation Army first started their first unit 150 years ago. It's a line we used to remind the government that the Salvation Army were involved in housing before the government. And it's a really important point that the community housing sector, we get massive swings, and we're experiencing another one at the moment where there is a need for massive investment in housing. And the Labour Party too often feels that the housing needs to be controlled by them. Then the National Party comes in and says, right, we'll sell them. And in fact, the bridge between those two factions is often the community sector. So a couple of weeks ago, Paul Gilbert and I sat at the end of a select committee, and one of the points that we made was that the government can't afford to pay for what the community sector brings. Because what community sector brings is it brings the caring of all sorts of disciplines, of people who will volunteer to put energy into their local communities to actually house people because they believe in it. And the government has a really important role in making sure that all the sectors are working together. And it was fascinating at the select committee where we had the Institute of Architects, we had the Property Council, and Infrastructure New Zealand and Community Housing Aotearoa, and we're all presenting submissions together, and it looked like we'd written our submissions in the same room. And it was really wonderful because each of us referred to the other, and we said, we can't do it without the Property Council. The Property Council said, we believe the community housing sector is really important. And the guy, Chief Executive of Infrastructure New Zealand, who by the way is going to retire to Christchurch, so he won't be sitting around for long, I can guarantee. I'll find his address real quick. And he was talking about the role of each of the sectors. And with housing, this is really, really, really important. Because the line I use is that when my mother and father, who had a depression, a world war, an earthquake in my mother's case in Napier, the government at the time provided stability to the families that had had nothing but instability. And so there'd be most of us in this room can remember our mothers capitalising their family benefit. They can remember 3% loans. And we all grew up with kids in state houses. And there was no social stigma to the state house. And so when the new boss of Housing and Urban Development took his job, I said to him, the first person you should employ is a historian, because the historian will tell us that we got it right in the past and we've got to get it right again. So I want to introduce to you, first of all, Campbell Roberts. Campbell has, in my opinion, is the great thinker in community housing in this country. And he has been respected by parties of all persuasions. He's the guy that stands up and speaks for the little people, the voice of the voiceless. So put your hands together and welcome Campbell Roberts. He's also left his hearing aids in Auckland. Yes, so there's no questions for him. Right, you have to swallow.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Gary. Thank you, Gary. It's always a bit dodgy to accept an invitation from Gary because you never quite know what you're going to sort of end up doing. But I'm really delighted to be here, and delighted to be here because I've already met people who have been important in my past or who I've admired in terms of their contribution to New Zealand society. So thank you to those of you who have done that, and it's really great to be in Christchurch. I think you always get a more intelligent audience in Christchurch.
You're trying to butter up.
Wrong crowd.
Yeah, well, I wasn't thinking about you particularly. It is delightful to be here. I was thinking today that you can take three ordinary people or three ordinary young people, and they can have very similar backgrounds, very similar education, go to very similar jobs, and yet 50 years on end up in very different financial positions. And I can guarantee you that one of the elements of that will be whether they got into home ownership or not, and when they got into home ownership, and they're able to build on that capital which they put together. And so I guess we've come to talk to you about the KiwiBuy campaign, and it really is about saying home ownership is still important. It isn't the only thing that's important in the housing space. There's a lot of other things that are important as well. But last year the Salvation Army did a report which looked at housing generally, and particularly looked at what was going on. And we came across some really disturbing things. One was that a lot of people in New Zealand, there has been a sort of housing continuum. And how it's worked in New Zealand is people have entered often entered through social housing or state housing. So they've gone to state housing at a time when they had a young family, were reasonably vulnerable in terms of their income, got settled down, and then they got a bit of money together and they're able to move on. They might have gone into a rental house, and so went into a different house and were able to spend a little bit more money. And then, or perhaps they were able to borrow a low interest loan that the government provided them, as we mentioned, the 3% loans, and they moved into home ownership. And they started to pay back the mortgage over a period of years until they owned their own home. And in some instances, they borrowed off that home to start businesses and start enterprises in New Zealand. And that's been a continuum which has been really important in New Zealand. Now what's happened recently is that with land prices and the affordability of housing generally in New Zealand, is that the gap between those early aspects of housing, state housing, rental housing, has just become too big. And people have been unable to make that jump from here to here. And so, and one of the reasons that has happened is that the building industry in New Zealand suddenly had a lot of people who were able to buy housing. And they became less, if you go back to sort of 40s, 50s, people like Fletcher's, they built their business in building low-cost housing in New Zealand. So it was 1, 2 and 3 bedrooms, had 1 bathroom, perhaps didn't have a garage, and was most probably about 120 to 150 square metres. And people went into that. And then we got into a situation where people said, oh no, what we need is 250 square metre houses, we need 3 bathrooms, we need a double garage, and they started to build those sorts of houses, and of course there was a big market for that. And so people were not, the building companies were not building entry-level houses, they were building houses for people who were wanting to upgrade their houses or get bigger houses, and on it went. And so we had a whole building industry shift which actually stopped building low-cost entry-level houses, and then a whole lot of other aspects which actually drove the price of land up. And so we've got into the situation where we were not actually providing any low-cost housing, we weren't building them, and people were not able to enter them. And so the government, this recent government came in and said, well, what we need to do is we need to address the supply issue. And so they introduced their policy of KiwiBuild, and we're going to build 100,000 houses in 10 years. Now, I think when that policy was announced, there was a lot of excitement actually in New Zealand about the fact that somebody at long last was looking at the housing system and saying, hey, listen, we can't let a whole group of people not have housing. We've got to do something about that. And so building 10,000 houses a year seemed like a very good idea. Unfortunately, I think what had happened was that there was a good vision, it was a good macro idea, but I don't quite think the detail work had been done to actually make sure that that was going to be delivered, and that supply was the only problem. Because the reality was, supply wasn't the only problem. We did have this gap. People were not able now to buy into, even when there was an entry-level house, they weren't able to buy it because they just didn't have the cash to do that. And so over the last wee while, what has been happening in the community housing sector is a number of organisations have been looking at that situation. That's been happening over the last 10, 15 years. And they said, well, what are we going to do in this situation? Even if we take the profit out of housing, if we build quality housing, if we try to get them as cheaply as possible, and we build 50 at once and try and get some benefits from building in mass, even then we can't get the house price down far enough to allow people to get into it. So it has been a real problem and a difficult problem. So what community housing agencies said, we need to have some other products. It is not, we can't just have a product where somebody looks at a house and then goes along to the bank and gets a mortgage and buys the whole house. And so what's been happening in the community housing sector is there's been a number of products developed. One is called shared equity. And what is happening in shared equity is that community housing organisations are saying, well, perhaps that person doesn't need to buy 100% of the house. Maybe they could buy 70% of the house. They could afford that, so they can afford a mortgage of $500,000. They can't afford a mortgage of $700,000, but they can afford a mortgage of $500,000. So let them buy 70% of the house, and then when their income improves, or when the kids are a little less costly, or things are happening, or their house goes up in capital value, then maybe they'll be able to buy the rest of the house. And what is actually happening is the community housing organisations have found that's actually what happened. One community organisation that started on that said our people will be able to buy those houses within 15 years, and that they'll be able to move off and buy 100% of the house. What they found was that people were buying them in 4 and 5 years. They were seeing the benefits of doing that. They were making the sort of adjustments they needed to make in their income, and they largely the average time in which people are buying those houses is about 4.6 years. So that product has revolutionised the situation for many families. Families who thought it was impossible for them to get into home ownership have been getting into home ownership. Another product which has been working well has been rent to buy. So we're saying, okay, there are some people who all they can do at the moment is they can rent. But if they have a chance to get a house built for them, and they get to choose the curtains, and they get to choose what colour the paint's going to be on the wall, and they get to choose little bits of the design element, and then they move into that house and they start to rent it, then over a period of time, the value of that house increases. And if we were to give them back 25% of that value, that would be their deposit, and that would enable them then to get into a shared equity and buy perhaps a portion of the house. Well, again, that's a product that's been run by Habitat, run by the Housing Foundation and others, and literally hundreds of families in New Zealand have been able to use that methodology to get into housing and to start to buy housing, and it's made a remarkable difference. And we've got some remarkable stories of how families who just didn't think they had a chance have been able to make that gap. And that was it's addressed what has been that major problem in the New Zealand housing system. So what we've said, what we've been saying since we started this KiwiBuy campaign is we said, well look, these things are working successfully in the community. They're also working successfully internationally. They're being done sometimes in quite large scale. So why don't we do more of that in New Zealand? Why doesn't the government get involved in that? And you see the problem for why doesn't the community housing sector just do more houses? Well, of course, every time you need to leave in 30% of the house, it's an equity and you're going to get it back, but it actually takes a wee while to come back. So there's a limit to how much money you can do that. Now, but if the government were to come into that, there is nobody that can borrow money cheaper than the government. The government is able to borrow money, and particularly in the present international markets, they can borrow money at a very cheap rate. So why doesn't the government actually put money in and keep that equity share? It's not giving the money away, because all of those families are actually going to buy that house back, and the government is going to get its money back and able to recycle that money. So we've been selling that sort of program as what we've called KiwiBuild, or KiwiBuy, sorry, because there was already a KiwiBuild, and we used the word KiwiBuy because we felt that actually it fits alongside the government program. The government is building the houses. It's just that if you build a house at 700,000 or 750,000, there's not too many people that can actually buy it. But if you bring alongside a product which says, don't buy 100%, buy 70% of that house, then suddenly a whole lot more people can buy those houses and get into them. And so that's the sort of thing that we've been doing, where our effort has been to convince the government that they actually do need to start doing this themselves. They need to support community agencies who are doing it, and they need to open this out, because in fact if the government were to do this, at the moment there's $2.6 billion being spent each year on the accommodation supplement. Now that money at the end of the 12 months just disappears. There's no more new houses because of that spend. We haven't got one extra house as a result of that spend, and we've got to find another 2.6 billion for the next year. Well, that 2.6 billion, if that was new houses, that would be about 6,000 or 7,000 houses a year that would be produced. But we're only saying you only have to buy a third of that house. So that immediately, if you were spending that same amount of money in a program like this, you're most probably able to provide 25 to 30,000 houses a year, and suddenly it becomes a whole lot different. So that's what we've been promoting, that's what we're trying to do. We've got a website, we've got Facebook, we've started to talk to government, we've engaged with government and with political parties, because we're trying to do this cross parties and say, hey, this is an issue that really does need to be addressed. And I must say we've had certainly not an opposing response to it, but it's very difficult to get things to change, because the history of New Zealand housing is we tend to like the big lever approach, that okay, we'll pull this lever and then it'll all change, and then the next government comes in and pulls another lever, and the problem is that they don't work in sync with each other, and the market sort of goes up and down like this, and we don't get consistency. We do need to have a situation where there is consistent aim about what we're doing, and there will be different, because of political philosophies, there will be different ways of approaching it. But we do think that if we were to take this product, now this isn't the only answer, of course, and I don't want to sort of appear simplistic in terms of this, that the only answer in New Zealand's present housing crisis is home ownership. There of course does need to be still social housing. There needs to be each part of that continuum dealt with. But what we're saying at the moment is that home ownership and its failure, when when people can't step out of that social housing or that rental housing gap, what happens is that number builds up. You need far more rental, you need far more state houses, you need far more rental housing. Well, in fact, those sectors have been on the decline. And so, and if you're trying to build social housing, that's a very expensive option because you've got to put all the money in, and you're only getting back a very small part of the rent. So it is a more expensive option. So if you can minimise the number of people that you actually need to spend that sort of money on, and put more money into this and move people up and get that continuing working again, then economically that's a far better answer for the country. Perhaps, Paul, you'd just like to specifically talk about aspects of the...
Any other areas you want to cover? No, keep going.
Okay, cool. Yeah, glad to do that. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Ken. That's good. Kia ora, I'm Paul from the New Zealand Housing Foundation. Gary, you said some other people were going to be here, they're not here. David from Community Housing Aotearoa, and who else?
Claire.
Oh, Claire from Habitat for Humanity, so apologies from them, but I will do a little bit of speaking on their behalf. So just for those of you who don't know, the community housing sector in New Zealand is roughly 100 organisations. We're in every one of your communities, from the west coast to Invercargill to way up north. IHC, which is now called Accessible. We are City Missions. We are Habitat for Humanity. We are Accessible. We are Salvation Army. Otatahi here in this context, that took over the council housing. So just to give you a sense of the scale, 13,000 homes we own or look after across the country, and so that roughly 25,000 people go to sleep in one of our houses every night across New Zealand. And so we cover that whole spectrum that Campbell has talked about. If you think about that screen there as representing the totality of all of the dwellings and homes and apartments in New Zealand, there are about 1.8 million in the country. I'm not including cars in that, that's just actual houses. And a very small portion of those, around 100,000, are in the segment that we've been talking about, which at the very, very end is emergency and transitional housing, the sort of stuff that City Missions and some marais have been doing more recently. And then the next big segment, which is dominated by Housing New Zealand, is the social rental space, which you can tell by one of two means whether it's a social rental house. Usually it's where the money's coming from, which is through the Ministry of Social Development and income-related rent subsidies, or else who owns the asset, which is frequently the government, less and less councils owning houses.
Can you speak up a bit, please?
Yeah, sure, sorry, I'll speak into the mic. Yeah, sorry, apologies. The big issue that we're trying to address with this KiwiBuy campaign is the very, very significant and growing gap, the affordability gap, which has been caused by the wild divergence which has occurred between incomes, which have flatlined or mildly increased, and house and land prices, which have increased very dramatically. And if we look back 30 years to the reforms of the early 90s and the mother of all budgets, that was one of the really big root causes, because from the 1950s until 1991-92, the government, as Campbell said, was consistently investing in lower quartile affordable houses to the tune of between 300 million a year to 2,000 million a year every year. Every year. 300, 500, 2,000, 1,500 million dollars from 1950 to 91, and pretty much in 1991 it went to zero, and it's been zero for 30 years. And so if you don't send the purchasing signal to the market that you want affordable houses, the market will not deliver them, because it costs money to deliver affordable housing outcomes, which is what we're trying to do as the community housing sector. And so it's a big job, but it's going to take us a long time to fix this problem. We're going to all have to work together, the government, the community housing sector, the private market. We're all in this together is a really important message. So we've got in what we're describing this evening, a very narrow solution to a small part of the problem, which is trying to bridge the affordability gap for key worker households. And in our sector, we call it the intermediate market. Another way of describing that is the can work but can't afford to rent or buy market. So those are people who get up in the morning, go to work, get the kids to school, pay their taxes, and can't afford to rent or buy a home. And there are 200,000 households in that space in the New Zealand market at present. And that's on a definition of affordability. At 1/3, you're paying no more than 1/3 of your gross combined household income on either your rent if you're a renter or your mortgage if you are in an ownership product. So this is a big national problem. 100 to 120,000 of those households are in Auckland, and the other 80 or so thousand are spread across the country. They're particularly concentrated in places like Nelson, used to be more intense here in Christchurch, Tauranga, Hamilton a bit. So Blenheim, the Blenheim's a hot spot as well. And so what we're doing is we're using these rent to buy and shared ownership products as an affordable bridge for those people in New Zealand who don't have a bank of mum and dad, someone in their life who's got equity that they can share with their children to get them onto the property ladder. Now, not everybody wants to own a home. We had that conversation earlier, right? Two renters sitting in the front row. We get that. But the problem is that the government's throwing $3,000 million a year, as Campbell's just told you, at the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and we agree we need an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. But more and more people are going there because that's where all the money's going. And there's nowhere else for them to go because there are no affordable housing choices available to them. And so what we're trying to do is just provide a hand up and an option for those families and households that have the desire to lift themselves out of the rental poverty trap and on a pathway to home ownership. And so the products are really simple. Habitat's products are slightly different from ours, but the Housing Foundation product is basically a simple rent-to-buy product. We find you and your family. We ask you, what's your life like? Where do you live? Where do you work? Where do you want to live? How many kids have you got? What's your income? Therefore, I know how much you can afford and how big the house needs to be, because no use me providing you an affordable 2-bedroom home if you've got 5 kids, right? We build a new house for you. As Campbell said, you choose the carpet, the curtains, the wall colours. We have a 5-year rental agreement. Day 1 we value, year 5 we value. If during the course of those 5 years the property value has appreciated, we gift 25% of that value uplift to you to use as a deposit to purchase into the shared ownership scheme. The rent is set at 1/3 of your gross household income. The ownership product is you buy as much of the house as you can afford to based on 1/3 of your gross household income. We own the rest of the house with you, interest free. It's not a second mortgage. It's interest-free shared ownership. We obviously don't live in the house with you, it's your house. And as you can afford to, you buy us out. And as Campbell said, the average is about 4.6, 4.7 years. We designed the product for 15 years. There's 150 families have graduated so far through our program to full independent home ownership, hundreds in the program. And we had a meeting on this very sofa this afternoon with the chairman of a bank, and he said, what's the default rate on your ownership scheme? And I'm pleased to say 0. Never had a default. No mortgagee sales in the history of this program. So it's better than your average high street mortgage product with people walking in and getting a mortgage on the market. So the message from us is to the government, we think it would be a really great idea if you worked with products like this to make KiwiBuild, which is a good idea but not really affordable for a whole lot of people, affordable for a much wider range of lower income key worker families. These are our policemen and nurses and teachers and administrators and cleaners. They're the people who keep our cities and communities running, and they just can't afford to live close to where they work or where their kids go to school or where they choose to go to church or where their marae is. So how do we keep and retain communities as cohesive places, thriving places rather than people having to move further and further away because they can't afford to live where they need to be to do the things they need to do to be alive and thriving. So that's the general idea. And that's so great, thanks. And we're hoping the government pick it up and run with it, really, because they're doing a KiwiBuild reset, and there's a big opportunity for them to do that.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Questions?
Thanks. That sounds very convincing. What
Can you hear Axel?
Speak into it.
Swap. Speak into
Just
it.
hold it closer.
No,
it's dead. That's what.
No, it's not dead.
Yeah, it doesn't show.
That's not a German one, it's an English one.
See what I mean?
The light's gone out.
Yeah, see what I mean? Thanks. That was a very convincing presentation, or two presentations. Having sat down with Phil Twyford, having had long, in-depth discussions with him, I think he's a clever chap. You would have sat down with him. What does he have to say about this?
Well, he lost his job recently.
He did. He did.
I'll leave this one for Campbell.
Sorry, who was?
Questions about Phil Twyford.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time talking to politicians, and they're not easily convinced by anything. And one of the dilemmas, I think, is that as soon as somebody becomes the Minister of Housing, they have a trail of people through their emails and their phone and with the latest solution about how they can fix housing. And so they become very shy of new ideas very quickly. And also they've got a bureaucracy that is not known for being innovative and wanting to move into new situations. I think Phil's situation is that he most probably, they'd sold the KiwiBuild thing. They really needed to deliver that. And so he didn't really want to hear anything outside of KiwiBuild because he actually did need to make that work. And of course it wasn't able to be worked, and most probably he's paid rightly or wrongly paid the cost of that. But look, our conversations with government have been encouraging. They certainly haven't been opposed to this idea. They are welcoming of it, but I think it's all part of it. Takes a long time to convince people that actually this is what you should do, and I'm hopeful that in the reset some of the ideas we're talking about actually will be picked up. I have good reason to believe that will happen. It will be the extent in which that is done, and also making sure, because one of the things that we've suffered from a number of times, I mean personally I've been blamed for KiwiBuild because Annette King said, well actually the idea came from Campbell Roberts, and we well the idea came when we had a bit of a conversation in the car, which was about 5 minutes long, and so often the difficulty is that they grab hold of an idea, but they don't grab hold of the detail. And it is in the detail of these programs that the difficulty comes, and often also, to be fair, they are advised by people who don't have a lot of experience or haven't had to put their money into something. And so I mean, housing is, I don't want to be simplistic here, housing is a very, very complex thing to get right. And Bill English actually said to me, not long before they went out of government, he said, I've never realised how complex, he said, I don't think as politicians we've really understood housing. He said, he said, go across all the parties, he said, I don't really think we've understood housing. And he said, I am just starting to understand it. And he's gone. So, I think this is part of the difficulty.
The other thing too that's quite important is that the community housing sector comes under Chris Farfoy, who has got a really good track record already as an effective minister, and that's a really important thing. And Chris grew up in a state house in Phillipstown, and he stood up and said, I'm really proud of the fact I grew up in a state house. But there's a very good leader of housing and urban development, the chief executive, Andrew Crisp, is a superb fellow, and so he's really going to, and he's talking very closely to the community housing sector. Rosal.
Kia ora, Paul and Campbell. Fantastic to see you both again. I thought you hit the nail on the head in terms of the government when you said they get a lot of emails and suggestions, blah blah blah, and the underlying issue here is that the government does not see itself in partnership, in collaboration with the third sector, and that this is a problem across the board, you know, not just in housing.
No.
And I wonder if you have any idea about how we address that, because it seems to me that they should be going not to just the list of emails, but here are our serious memorandum of understanding partners here. What can they help us? How can we work together?
Absolutely. I think that it's we just haven't learned how to cooperate on these things, you know, and part of that is their political process, isn't it? People are in for 3 years. They've got a really complex things like housing, and they don't know if they're going to get another 3 years, so they've got to deliver it in this 3 years. And if you start listening to people, it's going to take you time to do that, and by that time your time's over and you've been elected out. So I think it's part of the political process, the 3-year political process. I think that doesn't give us a good basis for complex situations like this. But the other thing is, I think we do need to learn how in New Zealand to work together. And it isn't only the community sector, it's the private sector, it's government working together and getting the right people in place. And I think this is what, again, I think often on these crucial boards, there's been far too many political appointments of people who have not been appropriate people for the roles that they're undertaking, and they haven't got the experience that they need. I think in the bureaucracy, there's been huge changes in the last number of years, with people coming in with very little experience in the areas that they're actually controlling, and that makes the job very difficult. But what we're trying to say is, look, we want to work with you. And we're saying that to all politicians. We want to work with you. We want to come alongside you. We want to help you to achieve what because there is nothing wrong with the desire that this government has put in place about what it wants to achieve in housing. We all agree with that vision, and that, but it's about sitting down together and saying, how do we achieve that vision together? And that's not what Rosemary, that's, you know, it is continual frustration really to try and I see it's not only in this sector. I mean, you take about the fact that we set up a welfare working group. You know, a lot of work is done in that particular area, and it's almost as though we didn't expect that group, which was you know, when you look at the membership of that group, you knew that in 12 months' time they were going to come up with something reasonably radical and reasonably that was going to cost you a lot of money. Well, I don't know why, when you set it up, you didn't put some money aside to actually implement some of those things. And I think that's the sort of difficulty where we put it into a group, we are happy for that group to beaver away for 12 months, and then suddenly it's as though we've got a big surprise in the things they're saying, whereas in fact we've got to work together over long term and be consistently in dialogue, and that's what we're trying to encourage.
Okay, I'd just like to add just briefly to that question, which is an important one, around the collaborative capacity of our sector and, as Campbell said, private market and other players. I think that the key thing from our perspective is place-based solutions. So every context, every community, every location is different, as is the housing need in that context, in terms of the incomes of the families, the compositions of the families, the appropriate locations and typologies that might work, and the tenures that might work in any given context. So at the Housing Foundation, for example, over the last 10 or so years, we've built 850 homes in about 37 different locations. And every development has been completely different from the one before it, because the people who lived in that community had different needs, and therefore the mixture of houses and the mixture of tenures was different in that context. So for example, the one we're doing at the moment, with a piece of land we just purchased from Auckland Council in South Auckland, is completely surrounded by Housing New Zealand houses. So they don't need more Housing New Zealand houses there. What they want is a different mixture of opportunities to move to home ownership. Whereas in another place they did need Housing New Zealand houses, and that was totally appropriate for us to work with the government and Housing New Zealand in that context, because that was the right answer for that community. So I think the history of government is not great on innovation, and that's what we bring as the community housing sector, with the sorts of products and the placemaking and the pepper potting and the mixed typologies of having everybody of different incomes and different tenures all mixed up with each other. And so there's real value to add there. So really in favour of working in partnership with government and continuing to bring our innovation there, but making sure that it's based on deep understanding of the local specific context, and even different suburbs, as you well know here in this context. Even different suburbs have different needs. So really important to match the place with the need, the demand, and then you get to the supply side solution after you've done the hard work. That's how to give successful, thriving, long-term community outcomes.
Has it ever been proposed that the land would, house would be built on leasehold land, with the possibility, with the owners having the option of buying out the lease in the future, or not, as they wish?
Yeah, well, that's part of the KiwiBuy that we didn't talk about, and I think the Queenstown Lakes is an example of that. Whereas through inclusionary zoning, part of each development is being passed back to the council, so that 10% of each of the sections developed in any site, 10% have got to be passed back to the council. What the council's doing is putting those over to the Queenstown Lakes Trust. And what Queenstown Lakes Trust is doing is saying these sections are now available for people to build on, and you can lease the section for 100 years, and you will get it at a sort of at an affordable rent, and it will only increase by the level of the CPI each year. And what people are doing in that situation is they are buying houses, they're building houses, and of course what the reality now is the cheapest bit of, in many markets, the cheapest bit of a house is actually the house. The land is the bit that's more important. And did you say 58% of the cost of a house in Auckland now is the land? That's the difficulty, and so and that would be a similar situation, I would imagine, in Queenstown. So what's happening there is people are able to build a new house. It's their house. They must sell it back to the trust at the end, but they can stay in it as long as they like, and the leasehold. Leasehold is certainly a possibility, and that what's happening there could be expanded across the country. The difficulty, of course, is that once you're into that leasehold situation, if you want to move to another part of the country, you've only got enough money to actually do it in another leasehold situation. So the leasehold does need to be spread throughout the country, but it's certainly, you're quite right, it's an option which we should be pursuing more, and the government has obviously got land holdings which would enable it to do that.
I'm sure that's been done years ago.
Yeah, yes. Look, none of these, you're quite right, none of these are new solutions. And I suppose, I was talking to somebody before the meeting, the reality is, all of these things, New Zealand had a situation where it had solved its housing crisis. New Zealand had a great record in the 50s and 60s of actually having a well-housed nation, and was most probably the model around the world. What we've managed to do is undo what we already had achieved, and leasehold was one of the things which was actually established in the past, and we've undone it. So, and part of that is, I think, the impact of market economics, which has basically said we need to own everything. You know, it's about that's, and I think we've had that shift, and that's affected the mindset of people.
Yeah, I just come in there. You know, the elephant in the room is what you just said. Is that huge market expectation, and what New Zealand is doing, or people have been fooled, is to buy big houses, sell them, make a profit, and everything, the GDP will go up and everything will be wonderful. And I wondered if you have taken your, you know, as Simon Bridges comes out and latches onto the cancer issue and tries to sell it to the people, I wonder if he would ever latch onto your idea, which is starting to fill the gap. It's really good. Would the National Party honestly latch onto that as a solution in terms of getting voted in and doing the right thing? Because no, I don't think so, because the whole property issue in New Zealand is all around making my money, making my nest egg, buying a few rentals, owning them, and the selfishness of property ownership, you know, sort of thwarts all of that. You know, I'd love to know what your thoughts on that.
Political stunt.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The vested interests in the market are enormous and well organised and very powerful. I heard someone say the other day that the property market is 4 times GDP by value. So
Bernard Hickey.
Was Bernard Hickey, was not, yeah, not to be underestimated, as you say. Look, this from our perspective, we've had a few really good meetings around Christchurch with community groups during the day, and it's an issue of social justice from our perspective in terms of there's something wrong and we need to have a crack at making it right and doing the very best that we can to fix and provide opportunity for those who want to avail themselves of that. Those big structural issues will remain. We're very grateful in our context with the Housing Foundation that, for example, we're starting to tap into the global trend which is called impact investment. So we're now tapping into funds where people are saying, actually, you know what, I've got enough. And I now have some spare money that I want to use, but instead of doing impact, instead of making more money out of my money, I want to do impact first before I do profit. And thank God that that's a globally emerging trend, and it's happening here right now in New Zealand, and we're securing significant millions of dollars of impact first money that's being lent directly into the Housing Foundation as we speak, to try and reverse what you're talking about. But greed is alive and well. Let's not kid ourselves, right? It is alive and well.
Do either of you have any comment about alternative housing form? I've lived in several countries and I see significant benefit in different form, but I wonder what.
Do you mean like co-housing and Abbeyfield and stuff like that? Or
multi-unit dwellings, tower blocks, the lot.
Yeah. Look, I think there's real advantage. Again, one of the things that we struggle with, I think, in New Zealand is there has been this traditional way of looking at housing. You know, like it started off as the sort of quarter acre. We've moved away from that, and people got a house with a mortgage and that now. And we haven't kept ourselves up to date with what's happening internationally in terms of, I mean, for instance, if you take the rental sector in New Zealand, it's basically about people investing in their retirement who get into rental housing. It isn't a developed market at all, and those houses are likely to be sold or changed or whatever, whereas in every other country, you've got a developed rental market. You've got people who are in there long term and who are providing rental housing, and they're providing it. Sometimes people are renting for the whole of their lives. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But you're not going to do that in New Zealand you're not going to say I'm going to rent a house for the whole of my life, because you know that you won't actually stay in it. You know, like you'll do it for 6 months and then the owner will come back from overseas and you have to move to somewhere else. So we do need those varieties. Certainly we need the medium density development, we need the high density development, and we have to get used to living in a different way in New Zealand. So that's another thing, and it's about all of us changing our attitudes. Really, it's about all of us realising that part of the answer to this is about how we actually view this ourselves, and start to have different expectations and not sort of try to replicate what has always happened, in a sense. I mean, I just take my own example. We bought our house in Auckland 7 years ago. We bought it for $400,000. Last week, the house, which is identical next door to us, sold for 1.2 million. So 400,000 to 1.2 in 7 years. Now, I mean, what effectively that says is the young family that could afford a mortgage of 400,000 7 years ago hasn't had that increase in salary, hasn't had that increase in income. And so we've got this crazy situation in which we're inflating prices, and frankly, as homeowners, we've got to actually stand up and say this is not good enough, and this is not what we want to happen. And we need to say that to our politicians, and we need to say we want a different sort of economy. And of course, we missed out on the opportunity of really an example of where we're at in New Zealand is the fact that we couldn't get a capital gains tax over the line. I mean, the fact that we couldn't get a capital gains tax over the line is a real indication of where we are in New Zealand. Until we are serious about those sorts of things, then we are not going to make progress. And a capital gains tax is actually something that needs to happen. And politicians, have backed away from it again. And the reason they've backed away from it, you can't blame the politicians. You've got to say it's the problem of the electorate. If they'd introduced a capital gains tax, what they know is they would have been out on their ears. And so we have got to, as individuals, start talking to our friends in our situations and saying this attitude has got to change, and that we actually do need a capital gains tax. And the reason we need a capital gains tax is not for our own benefit, it's for the benefit of our children, the benefit of our grandchildren, the benefit of a socially just society in New Zealand, in which will impact and change things. Sorry, I don't know whether I answered your question.
No, it's fine.
But I think there does need to be those variety of there's a whole creative, internationally there are so many creative things happening in the housing space.
Agreed.
And we just need to start looking at those.
But we're not very creative.
Used to be.
Thank you very much indeed. Your last comment, I say hear, hear. But what I want to say to you is not ask a question, but make a comment. What you have outlined tonight is the story of my lifetime. From nearing adolescence of the end of the war, my mother begging for a state house from Balclutha, and they told her, there's one in Christchurch, do you want it? And she said yes and brought us here. But what you have outlined is actually exactly why, in my antiquity, I am sitting in the family home completely mortgage-free. Thank you very much.
Talking of antiquity, John.
Ditto. Because we were talking before, Campbell, you know, what you'd said about when I first came over here, they came over because they wanted houses built in Invercargill for the smelter workers. That's where you and me first met down there. And we were turning them over and with 10 times as fast as they turned over houses now. And that was doing all the work on the house, on the site, cutting your own studs and doing everything there. Now everything comes assembled and they just stand it up, but it's taking 10 times as long to put them up. So yeah, we used to do it. What we're talking about there, all the stuff you're talking, we did it. It's not exactly have to learn what to do because we used to do it. And now I'm absolutely pleased I don't work in the building industry anymore, because now we've got all the MB guidelines and building codes and God knows what else. And with all the councils and everybody's got to fill the forms in that it's taken longer to get the permit to build than it does to build. With all the bureaucracy, it's just crazy. So that's one point, just another, just a bit different what you were talking about, but there's a lot of older people. Just take my wife and I. We live in the family home. It's far too big for us. And we are quite happy to look, we're looking for somewhere smaller. But it's virtually impossible to find anywhere that's smaller because they haven't been building any. The only place where there's smaller houses is in retirement villages.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people like us that would move on to somewhere smaller. We don't want to go into some old, you want a decent place. But they're not there. We haven't been building them. Every place that's been built now has got 3 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms, and it's crazy the way we've been building stuff. So it's in a bloody mess, quite frankly.
Well, it's one of the problems, isn't it? Like if you've got 400 square metre section, most developers and builders will say what you've got to do is build the maximum that you can on that site to make the profit that you need. Because if you build something smaller, you're not going to make the profit that you made. So
but it's this buying by the price per square metre.
Yeah.
I mean, one big room like this would be twice as much as a small end.
Yeah.
And it's the small end where the bathroom is and the kitchen is and the toilets are.
Yeah.
But you could double the size of this room and it wouldn't take twice as much to build because you just move that wall that way and build them bits in there.
Yeah.
And it's just skews the whole prices by doing it per metre.
Yeah.
Per square metre.
Square metre.
And what the houses we're talking about that are being built by Habitat and the Housing Foundation are just that. They are 120, 150 square metres. They've got a garage or no garage. They've got 1 bathroom and people want them. But as you say, it's been really difficult to get those houses. But it is some of the constraints that are on the building process now. Is a nightmare. I mean, I'm currently trying to get 150 apartments built in Auckland for the Salvation Army for social housing, and the amount of time we spend getting we'll have spent far more time. In fact, we'll have spent twice the amount of time getting them to the consent stage as we will in actually building them. We'll spend twice as long in terms of that. And it's just something seriously wrong. Now, of course, one of the things that's happened, for instance, in Auckland, I think, is that all the best planners have now been swallowed up by the major firms. And so they're all being paid big salaries. And the people who are left to go into the council are all the people that are left over. And they're not necessarily the sharpest in the box. So I think...
Does the council worker wants to ask a question?
It's going to be a curly one now. Kia ora, Campbell. Kia ora, Paul. It's great to hear you talk, and of course following on from your recent week in Wellington. Like Margaret, I was approaching adolescence when, at the time of the war was ending. Well, in my case, it was the Vietnam War. As my parents were buying their first house, and they did it by capitalising family benefit. This was back in the mid-70s. I was about 10. I said to my father, well, how much did the section cost? He said $4,000. And I said to him, how much did the house cost to build the house? And he said $20,000. So it's a total inverting of the land and construction costs. And I think what we're touching on here is things around the whole marketisation, commodification of housing. Once upon a time, it was a means that we established our security in old age, when you get there, of course, Margaret, home ownership and good levels of superannuation. And so those things are clearly getting picked away. And I hear some of your commentary linking shared equity to those sorts of things, because as fantastic as shared equity is, by itself, of course, it won't change anything. The market will say, thanks very much, that's nice of you to go and do that. We just want to keep doing what you're doing. So you're beginning to link it into some of those things, and just wondering what your thoughts are on how much you push the policy agenda with shared equity, whether shared equity is a Trojan horse, I don't know. For example, when we start thinking about affordable housing requirements in developments, to really put the heat on, the acid on, and of course some of those affordable housing requirements end up being shared equity. So just wondering what your thoughts are on really pushing the policy, affordable housing policy agenda.
Yeah, look, I think you make a very important point. I've tried to say that during a closest of what we've been saying, is that what we're talking about in shared equity is a very small part of the answer. A very small part, but we've focused on that because we do think that there is a problem, a very specific problem in home ownership that shared equity can meet. But we do need to keep the pressure on the government across a range of issues. You know, we've got problems with supply chain into New Zealand. I mean, what we know is that our housing costs, our build housing costs, are more expensive than in other situations, and that's simply because of the suppliers. There is issues of the land and a whole series of issues that need to be looked at in terms of resourcing and consenting, and how all that happens, and the process that occurs in that regard, and in terms of the size of the houses, because we have had this situation in which people have been building big houses and a lot bigger. And one of the things that we've got now, this movement towards small houses, and I think there are some creative things, and we need to start moving that way. The reality is that some of the poorer families are being forced into a lot smaller houses, because we had an example in the Herald yesterday morning of a developer who's got a multi-storey development in Manukau, and it was full of 50 square metre apartments. 50 square metre apartments, and now what he's doing is he's cutting them in half into 21 and 20 and 30. So some people are going to end up in 20 square metres, and some can. Now internationally, people do live in those situations, and we are going to have to realise. But what's happening at the moment is that we're putting all the. It's not as though he's cutting them in half and making them half the price. No. What he's doing is cutting them in half and charging the same price. So now, instead of getting, and they're $400 a unit for the $400 for 20 square metres, where it used to be $400 for 50 square metres. It's now $800 for the 50 square metres. So we need to come in on that situation. We need to be dealing with a multitude of situations, and it's really difficult to know just where to target yourself at any stage. What we've done is we've targeted ourselves in the shared equity space, because we think that's something that needs to. We're going to actually stop doing that at a particular point. We said, and at that point we'll pick up another aspect of the situation.
Can you mention the petition?
Oh yes, I should mention that there is a petition on site. On our website is
KiwiBuy.kiwi.
KiwiBuy.kiwi. And we'd really, if you do think this is a good idea, we'd really be helped if you sign yourself and get friends to sign up, because obviously the more people that we can get signing that petition, the more pressure that it just puts on the government to do something about these things.
Gary will add it to our newsletter.
Yeah, I was in the newsletter, but I'll put it back next week. Last question. Yeah, just push it up. There's no
Yeah, it's,
no red.
Oh, there's no red. Okay, okay. Just to date me, I remember the very end of the state advances loans and the, I guess it was the family benefit capitalisation.
Yeah,
Just the very end of that. And my father, while I was growing up in the 70s, almost completely built the home I grew up in. I don't think that's so possible to do anymore. Unfortunately, because I think homeowner builders probably build better than many of these leaky home builders did back in the day.
Well, they leaked in a
The regulations were completely liberalised. And I just to go back to a point that was raised over here, I just heard that the building consent level has only just reached, as of today or yesterday, the same level it was in the 70s, which says a lot about everything you've been saying. The question I want to ask you, we're talking about this impact capital, and I'm wondering, can the community agency get together and form their own bank, maybe leveraging this capital to begin with? I have no idea how you start a bank. Just a thought to change the capital, environment.
It launches in November. It's called Community Finance.
So that's a really good point to finish on. I think you'd agree with me that we're lucky that we've got people like this with their amazing knowledge and amazing commitment. And the point that Campbell made at the end, where he sounded terribly like a lot of the Catholic priests I grew up with. You sure you're in the right outfit? Where he talked about social justice, and this is about social justice. This is about providing stability for our kids, for our grandchildren, for our mums and dads and granddads and grandmas, where we actually show that we do care. We're small enough to be able to solve this. And so I'd just like you to put your hands together. And thank you. Thank you very much, and I know it's a little bit cold in Christchurch and Auckland, but you'll get over it. The other thing is, just remember, next week we've got global settlement. So if anyone's interested in talking around about what submissions we should be making next week, then the submissions are the day after, so next Wednesday. So if you can let me know, I'll make sure that you're part of the network of working on it.